Karen approached the guard with her toy microphone, confident that her status as a blogger gave her the right to do anything. When her attempts to interview him failed, she started to belittle him. "You're just standing here for money and staying silent." But, unexpectedly, without moving, the guard spoke. "I'm just bored." And the entire crowd burst into laughter. It was a typical day in London. Clear skies, drifting clouds, and crowds of tourists who, as always, were losing their heads at the sight of the famous landmarks. They captured moments on camera, discussed the view of the Thames, and, of course, couldn't walk past Buckingham Palace without stopping. Right at the entrance stood a guard, tall, with a cold gaze that never seemed to tire. He was the embodiment of British discipline and dignity. Faces of tourists flickered before him, but his eyes were always fixed somewhere in the distance, as though he hadn't noticed the world around him changing. And then, among these tourists, there was Karen, a middle-aged woman with an unwavering belief that her opinion always mattered. She wasn't just a tourist or a passerby, she was a blogger, someone who always thought her presence at any location imbued it with special meaning. This time, her goal wasn't merely to see another guard, but to interview him. She held a microphone in her hand, but it was far from a professional accessory. The microphone was more like a toy set for children, purchased on discount at a nearby tourist shop. But to Karen, that didn't matter. In her world, anything was acceptable if it was for the sake of content. Approaching the guard, Karen stood directly in front of him, trying to make him pay attention to her. She raised the microphone and confidently began, "Listen, you must be tired of standing here all day, right? Maybe you could tell us what it's like to be a symbol of Britain. What do you feel when people take pictures of you with their phones?" The guard didn't move. He stood still, as he always did, his eyes twitching slightly, a barely noticeable movement that could have meant irritation or maybe humor. But Karen was sure he was simply holding back his emotions. She continued with forced cheerfulness. "Well, maybe just a few words for my blog, yeah? After all, you're an important cultural figure." The crowd of tourists had already started to slow down, confused about what was happening. But the guard, as always, remained silent. Karen, not giving up, took a step forward and almost leaned into his face, as though searching for a reaction. This was the start of her show, and she was ready for anything. Karen wasn't used to backing down. After her failed attempt to interview the guard, she decided the next step would be to cause a real scandal. The idea ran through her head. She would become the voice of all those who thought British guards were nothing but cardboard cutouts, standing on duty just to entertain tourists. She began fervently explaining to the crowd that the guard's silence wasn't professionalism, it was sheer laziness. Her face burned with indignation as her voice grew more insistent, as if she were trying to convince the world that she was right. "They're getting paid to stand there and do nothing. It's like a circus. How much longer can we tolerate these stereotypes?" She shouted into the camera, trying to draw attention to her protest. The camera captured every moment, and Karen could feel her popularity growing. Now it seemed like the whole world was on her side. The guard stood motionless, his gaze unchanged. At one point, Karen felt the atmosphere around her grow tense. People started to glance around, and she saw some expressions flicker with confusion or even displeasure. But she kept going, oblivious. Her anger pushed her to think quickly, searching for new ways to strike at tradition. Then she noticed tourists standing nearby, statuesque, with empty gazes as if they had just come from a museum tour. She pointed the microphone at one of them, deciding that at least someone should support her truth. But just at that moment, someone came up behind her. It was an old man. His face was wrinkled, and his eyes, despite his age, were bright. He stood right behind Karen and spoke in a soft but confident voice. "I'd suggest you stop." Karen turned around and for a second felt her confidence waver. This man, with an impeccably calm face, continued, "This isn't a show. It's about honor and tradition. You just don't understand what you're talking about." Her heart tightened. These words, spoken without aggression, but with respect and dignity, instantly stirred something strange in her. She didn't know how to respond. She had expected resistance, noise, but instead, she found herself face to face with something that wasn't in her script. She stood in silence, her expression shifting from confidence to confusion. The situation was slipping out of her control, and perhaps it was in that moment that Karen realized her fight for the truth was up against something much more significant than her thirst for spectacle. Karen didn't give up. That evening, she returned to the palace, confident that her plan would work this time. She decided to approach the task with more flair. In her hands was a huge banner that read, "Interview the calmest people in the world." She draped it around her neck, hoping it would divert attention away from her microphone, which, by the way, looked as if it had been pulled out of a toy box. She felt almost victorious as she approached the guard, waving the banner furiously to attract the attention of the tourists. As usual, the guard didn't budge, not even glancing at her. His silence only fueled her ambitions further. But, as often happens with Karen's plans, things didn't go as expected. Suddenly, a loud voice rang out from the crowd. "Awesome! We're gonna film you!" One of the teenagers, laughing and pushing his friends, rushed towards Karen and tried to grab her toy microphone. Everything happened so quickly, as if reality itself was playing a joke on her futile efforts. The microphone was now in the hands of one of the boys, and in her attempt to reclaim it, Karen found herself at the center of attention. Strangely, now she was the object of ridicule, not the guard. Tourists were filming her with their phones, and everyone was laughing. Karen felt her face turn red with shame and anger. Her plan was falling apart like a house of cards, but she couldn't give up. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But the guard stood motionless, his face utterly calm, as though everything happening around him was occurring to someone else. In some way, it was admirable, his resilience, despite the absurdity of the situation. "Well, what are you standing there like a statue for?" Karen yelled in desperation, but the guard merely shook his head slightly, not reacting. Karen felt her world crumbling. The plan had failed. She stood amidst the crowd, her microphone now a pathetic wreck, the teenagers still filming her, and all eyes were on her bewildered face. Her vain attempts to become the heroine of the day had turned into an epic of laughter. Instead of becoming a symbol of fighting against tradition, she had become a symbol of her own absurdity. The more she tried to do something, the deeper she dug herself into this ridiculous situation. She shot an angry look at the motionless guard, as if he were responsible for her failures. "Well, wait a minute. Are you saying this is nothing to you?" she shouted, desperately shoving the microphone into his face. And then, as if on cue, something happened that would become the final twist in her story. The guard, still impenetrable, like a stone statue, unexpectedly moved. Another guard approached him, clearly for the changeover. They began their ceremony of replacing each other, and as soon as the process was done, one of them, with restrained humor, said, "Well, at least film me. I'm just bored here." The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen froze, not knowing what to say. All her efforts, all her ambitions were crushed by this insignificant yet so genuine gesture. The guard and his replacement walked off, and Karen realized that her last attempt to break centuries-old traditions had faded into nothing. She couldn't understand what had happened and simply stepped aside with a sense of relief. In the end, no one remembered her interview, but everyone laughed for a long time, discussing how one woman had tried to break centuries-old traditions with a toy microphone and a banner. Karen walked away empty-handed, but with a new understanding. Sometimes, not every battle is worth fighting.